The year was 1839, and the town of Willow Creek slept under a blanket of superstition and silence. Nestled deep within North Carolina's dense pines stood a weather-beaten cabin, its windows fogged, its chimney breathing slow curls of smoke that smelled faintly of herbs and something metallic. The locals spoke little of the Harrow sisters, twins so alike that even their husband, Elias Ward, was said to hesitate before speaking one of their names. Some said they were born during a blood moon and that the midwife who delivered them refused to return to the Harrow home ever again. Others claimed the sisters' bond was unholy, a tie so strong that no man could come between them, until Elias did. They lived at the edge of the woods, beyond the reach of the church bell, where the land grew damp and the air thick with moss. Elias was seen in town once a month, always alone, his clothes clean but his eyes hollow. He bought flour, kerosene, and cloth, two of everything, and spoke to no one. The townsfolk noticed that his horse never approached the churchyard, as if frightened of the sound of hymns. It was said that after sundown, one could hear two women singing to the same child in two different voices, harmonizing through the wind that carried their melody across the trees. When the cries of an infant broke the stillness one autumn night, the town briefly rejoiced. Life, it seemed, had bloomed even in that cursed corner of the woods. But a week later, only one sister appeared on the porch. Her hair was unkempt, her dress torn, her eyes shifting like flickering lamps. She called herself Clara, though some swore her voice trembled in Celine's cadence. From that day, no one ever saw the other twin again. Elias told the sheriff that she'd run away after childbirth, but no one believed him. There were too many footprints outside the cabin that led nowhere, and a bonnet floating in the creek that refused to sink. Soon after, strange things began to happen. Hunters heard lullabies with no source. Lanterns flickered near the trees, as though someone, or something, walked between them, holding light. The infant's laughter echoed through the fog long after midnight, soft at first, then suddenly sharp, as if mocking whoever dared to listen. Those who passed by swore they saw two shadows in the cabin window, one rocking a cradle, the other standing still. And though the cabin doors were bolted from within, the forest around it seemed alive, whispering, waiting, and remembering. In the year 1839, the small and secluded town of Willow Creek in North Carolina was a place where time seemed to move slower, and whispers traveled faster than the wind. Surrounded by dense forests and low-lying fog, the townspeople often spoke in hushed tones about the strange happenings deep within the woods, where few dared to wander after dusk. Among the most haunting tales that passed from porch to porch was that of the Harrow twins, Clara and Celine, two sisters so identical that even their reflections seemed to hesitate before revealing which one they belonged to. They lived apart from the rest of the community, far beyond the last farmstead, in a wooden cabin whose smoke curled from the chimney like a silent signal that life, strange, quiet life, existed there. Yet it wasn't their isolation that drew the townspeople's curiosity, but rather the unsettling truth that both sisters shared one husband, a man named Elias Ward. Elias had arrived in Willow Creek years earlier, a tall, stern man with hands built for labor and eyes that carried more silence than words. He was a carpenter by trade and a wanderer by nature, but no one could understand how he had come to live with both sisters in the same home. Some whispered that Elias had married one of them and then, after her illness, took pity on the other. Others said it was darker, that he couldn't tell them apart and simply claimed both, unable or unwilling to choose. Whatever the reason, the arrangement bred unease among the townsfolk. The local preacher refused to visit that part of the woods, calling the union an abomination, while older women crossed themselves whenever the twins' names were spoken. The few travelers who passed near the Harrow cabin told unsettling stories, of seeing two women standing side by side in the clearing, their hands clasped together, wearing identical dresses and identical smiles, both calling out to the same man. At times, they were seen moving in perfect unison, like mirrored figures acting out a silent ritual only they understood. Children in town were warned never to wander near the Harrow woods, for strange lights were said to flicker between the trees, and a faint, wordless song could sometimes be heard at night, rising and falling like the breath of something that wasn't entirely human. Even the animals seemed to sense something wrong in that place. Horses refused to cross the old bridge leading toward their property, and dogs whined and pulled away when taken down the dirt path that led to the cabin. It was as though the forest itself recoiled from the secret it was forced to keep, the secret of two sisters, bound by blood and shadow, sharing one man and one fate. The townsfolk of Willow Creek rarely saw the Harrow sisters in person, yet their presence lingered in every whispered conversation and uneasy glance cast toward the forest's edge. Their cabin, hidden among the gnarled pines, became the center of countless stories told by lamplight, each more chilling than the last. It was said that strange lights glowed from within the trees long after midnight, flickering like ghostly lanterns in the mist. Travelers who took the narrow road that curved past the woods swore they saw faint candlelight moving between the trunks, sometimes in pairs, sometimes alone, drifting as if guided by invisible hands. No one could say for certain whether it was the sisters or something else entirely, but all agreed that the glow carried a rhythm, pulsing softly, like a heartbeat echoing in the dark. At times, when the wind fell still, the faint sound of a lullaby floated through the night air, a slow, mournful tune that sent chills crawling down the spine. The melody seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving through the trees, wrapping itself around the moonlit silence. Some claimed it was the voice of one sister singing to her unborn child, while others believed both voices joined together, harmonizing in eerie perfection. Those who had heard it described it as hauntingly beautiful, though heavy with sorrow, as if the song carried the weight of something buried deep within the earth. The townsfolk began to avoid the road after dusk, fearing that the music might follow them home. A group of young men once dared each other to walk near the Harrow woods at night, and when they returned, pale and trembling, they refused to speak of what they saw. One swore he glimpsed a woman standing just beyond the tree line, her white nightdress glowing faintly in the dark. Another insisted he saw two identical figures, both motionless, staring at them with hollow eyes that caught the moonlight like glass. From that night on, no one went near the cabin willingly. Yet despite the unease that gripped the town, there was something magnetic about the mystery. Children listened wide-eyed as their parents told them never to wander into the woods, and still, some couldn't help but imagine the two sisters standing together, their hands intertwined, singing to the night. Merchants who passed through spoke of feeling watched from the shadows, and one man claimed he found footprints, bare, delicate, and side by side, leading down to the creek, only to vanish halfway across the water. The woods seemed alive with the memory of the twins, their laughter and lullabies tangled in the branches, a soft echo that refused to fade, as if the forest itself had taken their secret and vowed never to let it go. When Celine finally gave birth, the dense woods of Willow Creek seemed to hold their breath. For weeks, faint cries had been heard drifting from the Harrow cabin, blending with the rustling of leaves and the sighing of the wind. The townsfolk, though wary of the sisters, couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity mixed with unease. Some spoke of joy, believing the birth of a child might bring normalcy to the strange household hidden in the trees. But beneath that brief moment of collective hope lay an undercurrent of dread, as if everyone sensed that something unnatural had just entered the world. The morning after the child's first cry, Elias Ward came to town alone, his clothes damp from rain and his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. He bought milk, blankets, and a small cradle, speaking in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. When asked about his wife and the baby, he gave only a nod and left without another word. For a short time, quiet settled over the woods. Smoke rose steadily from the cabin chimney, and neighbors passing along the old trail said they heard soft singing at dusk, one gentle voice, full of love, soothing the newborn to sleep. But the peace didn't last. Barely a week after the birth, the singing stopped. The light from the cabin windows went dark, and the forest, once filled with faint melodies, became oppressively still. It was Elias who broke the silence when he returned to town looking pale and unshaven, his boots caked in mud. He told anyone who would listen that Clara had left. No warning, no reason, she had simply gone into the woods one night and never come back. He said she was troubled, that the strain of the baby's cries and the isolation had driven her to madness. The townspeople wanted to believe him, but doubt clung to his story like fog on the river. If Clara had truly run away, why had she left behind her bonnet, her shoes, and her silver wedding band still resting on the mantel? And why had no one seen her footprints leading away from the cabin, only one set, Elias's, stamped deep in the mud by the back door? As the days passed, whispers began to grow. Some said they had seen a woman in white wandering near the creek at dusk, her hair loose and her eyes hollow. Others swore they heard the faint lullaby again, but now only one voice sang it, trembling and low, as if mourning something that could never be brought back. Elias Ward's explanation of Clara's disappearance never sat right with the people of Willow Creek. He told the sheriff that the sisters had quarreled bitterly after the birth of the baby and that Clara, overcome by jealousy or madness, had fled into the woods. He claimed to have searched for her for 2 days, calling her name until his voice gave out, but he found no trace of her, no footprints, no torn fabric, not even a strand of her hair caught in the brambles. The sheriff, an aging man named Harlan Pike, rode out to the Harrow cabin to see for himself. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of moss and smoke, and the forest seemed to grow denser the closer he got. When he arrived, Elias stood on the porch, his eyes red, his hands trembling, though whether from grief or guilt, the sheriff couldn't tell. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by a single candle. A cradle sat near the fire, the child within wrapped in thick blankets, quiet as sleep but too still for comfort. Pike noticed the signs almost immediately. A second bed stood untouched, perfectly made, the sheets stiff and cold. A bonnet hung neatly on a hook by the door, and on the small table beside the window lay a silver ring, the same one Clara had worn since the day she and Elias wed. He asked about it, but Elias only said she must have forgotten it in her haste to leave. The sheriff frowned at that. No woman he knew would abandon her wedding band, least of all Clara, who had always been proud of her union. As he moved through the room, Pike also saw that the floor near the hearth was freshly scrubbed, though the rest of the cabin was dusty and worn. The scent of lye lingered faintly in the air. When Pike questioned the remaining sister, she spoke softly, her voice strained and oddly detached. Her answers were brief, sometimes contradicting Elias's version of events, and at moments she seemed to lose her sense of self entirely, referring to her missing twin as if she were still in the room. Her eyes darted to the empty chair by the fire, and once, she even smiled toward it. The sheriff left unsettled, muttering to himself that something was very wrong in that cabin. Yet he had no proof, only instinct and the creeping feeling that the woods themselves were guarding a secret. Back in town, he told the townsfolk that Clara had likely lost her way and perished in the forest, though his voice lacked conviction. Even he couldn't shake the image of that cold ring gleaming in the candlelight, as if waiting for its rightful owner to return. After Clara's disappearance, the surviving sister's behavior began to unravel in ways that chilled anyone who came near the cabin. At first, she carried herself with quiet composure, tending to the baby and keeping the fire lit, but soon subtle changes crept in. Her speech grew disjointed, her laughter sudden and misplaced, and her eyes seemed to follow movements that no one else could see. She began referring to herself by both names, sometimes calling herself Clara, sometimes Celine, as though she could no longer distinguish where one sister ended and the other began. When Elias spoke to her, she would answer in two tones, one soft and sorrowful, the other sharp and almost mocking. Neighbors who ventured close to deliver food or help with chores left quickly, unsettled by the way her voice seemed to shift mid-sentence, as if two people were speaking through her in uneasy unison. At night, she was often heard talking to someone in the next room, murmuring conversations that carried through the thin cabin walls. Elias claimed she was praying, but those who passed by said her words didn't sound like prayers. They were fragmented sentences, half-whispered arguments, and sometimes pleas. The cradle often rocked on its own long after she had gone to bed, creaking slowly, back and forth, as though responding to an unseen hand. More than once, Elias awoke to find her standing over the child's bed, humming the same lullaby the twins used to sing together, her eyes distant and unblinking. The townsfolk grew certain that madness had taken her, though some whispered darker theories, that perhaps the sister who survived wasn't truly Celine at all. One merchant who delivered supplies claimed he heard her speaking in two voices at once, one calling out Elias, the other echoing the name Clara in perfect harmony. When he looked through the window, he swore he saw two shadows cast on the cabin wall, though only one woman stood inside. From then on, no one visited again. The woods grew thicker around the Harrow home, vines curling over the path as if nature itself wished to hide what lived there. Elias, once a strong and stoic man, began to waste away. His hands trembled when he worked, and he rarely left the cabin except to fetch water. He stopped going to town entirely, and those who glimpsed him from afar said he looked haunted, as though he were being watched even in daylight. The remaining sister's mind seemed to split further each day, her laughter echoing into the forest, sometimes joyful, sometimes despairing, until it became impossible to tell whether she was mourning her lost twin or becoming her. Weeks after the town had given up hope that Clara would ever return, a traveling preacher named Reverend Alden Hale arrived in Willow Creek, drawn by stories of sin, sorrow, and something unholy lurking in the woods. He was a stern man, deeply religious, known for his belief that evil could root itself in the hearts of the desperate. When he heard of the Harrow twins, two sisters sharing one husband, and one of them mysteriously vanished, he saw not tragedy, but temptation. Against the advice of the townsfolk, he declared his intention to visit the cabin and offer prayer, to cleanse whatever wickedness had taken hold there. On a gray morning thick with fog, he set out alone, Bible in hand, and the forest swallowed him whole. As he walked deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, heavy with the smell of damp soil and decay. Birds fell silent, and even the crunch of his boots seemed swallowed by the moss-covered ground. When he reached the clearing, the cabin appeared smaller than he'd imagined, lonely, weathered, leaning slightly as though exhausted from holding its secrets. Smoke drifted from the chimney, but the windows were dark. He knocked once, twice, and after a long pause, the door opened. The surviving sister stood before him, pale as wax, her hair uncombed, her eyes unfocused. She welcomed him in, her voice soft but oddly detached, like someone speaking in a dream. Inside, the preacher felt an immediate unease. The air was thick and still, the only sound a faint creaking from the cradle by the fire. 2 cradles stood side by side, though Elias had mentioned only one child. One was empty, draped with a small blanket patterned with stitched roses. The other held the infant, motionless, his skin pale and his eyes wide open but strangely vacant, as if he were staring at something unseen. When Reverend Hale knelt to pray over the child, he noticed that the woman began to hum under her breath, the same eerie lullaby that the townsfolk had described hearing in the night. The melody seemed to grow louder, weaving around his words until he lost his place and forgot the prayer entirely. As he rose to leave, something made him glance toward the dark corner of the room. There, faintly illuminated by the firelight, was a rocking chair moving gently on its own. The woman followed his gaze and smiled faintly, whispering, "She likes to sit there when the baby sleeps." The preacher froze, his throat dry, but said nothing. When he left the cabin, the woods felt heavier, darker, as though they were closing in behind him. He returned to town pale and trembling, warning the townsfolk that no man of faith should enter those woods again, for whatever lived in that house was beyond redemption. As the weeks turned into months, Willow Creek found itself consumed by a growing unease. The forest that surrounded the Harrow cabin no longer seemed like a place of nature but something sentient, alive, and watching. Those who lived near its edge began to complain of strange noises at night, the low hum of voices carried on the wind, the faint rhythm of a cradle rocking somewhere in the distance, and, most disturbingly, the sound of a child's laughter echoing from the direction of the old creek. No one dared to investigate after dark, for those who did swore that the laughter changed the closer they came, twisting from joy into something hollow and cruel, until it faded into whispers that sounded almost like words. Some said they heard the baby calling for its mother, others insisted it was the lost sister calling for her twin. The trees near the Harrow woods grew thicker, the paths narrower, and the usual wildlife seemed to vanish. Hunters who ventured near reported finding small handprints in the mud along the creek's edge, too small for an adult, yet spaced too far apart to belong to any living child. The prints never led anywhere, they simply stopped mid-step, as if whatever had made them had dissolved into the air. One man, a trapper named Amos Finch, claimed he saw the reflection of 2 women standing together in the creek's black water, even though he was alone on the bank. He fled without looking back, saying later that the reflections had smiled at him, but their faces were wrong, their eyes too wide and too bright. At night, faint lights began appearing between the trees, glowing orbs that flickered like lanterns, weaving through the darkness as if searching for something. Farmers on the outskirts said they saw figures moving in those lights, tall and thin, drifting rather than walking. When they reported this to the sheriff, he dismissed it as imagination, though he refused to go near the woods himself. The town's children were told to stay away from the creek, yet some swore they heard the lullaby carried over the water on still evenings, sung in a voice that was neither kind nor cruel, but endlessly sad. Fear began to shape the rhythm of the town. The Harrow woods became a forbidden place, a boundary between the living and the lost. Each new moon seemed to bring another story, an echo, a flicker of light, a fleeting glimpse of movement where no one should be. And through it all, that laughter continued, faint but persistent, a child's joy turned into something far darker, threading through the trees like a ghost that refused to be forgotten. The summer storm that tore through Willow Creek that year was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Thunder rolled across the hills for hours, shaking the ground, while sheets of rain poured from the heavens and turned the dirt paths into rivers of mud. Lightning split the sky over the Harrow woods again and again, each flash revealing the dark silhouettes of trees bending beneath the wind. When morning came, the storm had left behind a silence more dreadful than the chaos that preceded it. The air was heavy and still, the ground littered with broken branches and uprooted roots. It was in the aftermath of that storm that the townsfolk made their most disturbing discovery. A group of loggers, sent to clear fallen trees near the Harrow property, noticed a patch of earth that had shifted behind the cabin. The rain had washed away a layer of soil, exposing the corner of an old wooden trunk buried shallowly beneath the roots of a pine. Its lid was warped and swollen from the moisture, but something about it, the iron lock rusted nearly through, the faint smell of decay, compelled them to open it. Inside, wrapped in damp cloth and streaked with mud, lay a small leather-bound book. Its pages were warped, many stuck together, yet the words that could still be read chilled every man who looked upon them. The diary was written in two distinct hands. One neat and delicate, the other sharp and hurried. The first entry spoke of simple things, days spent sowing, gathering herbs, tending to the garden, and the happiness of expecting a child. But as the pages went on, the tone changed. The delicate handwriting became erratic, filled with fear and jealousy, writing of a sister who had grown distant and a husband who whispered in the dark when he thought no one was listening. The second handwriting began about halfway through the book, claiming to be the true wife of Elias Ward, calling the other twin an impostor who had stolen her place. Each entry contradicted the last, each accusing the other of deceit, of madness, of being the copy that must be erased. The final legible page bore a single line scrawled in smudged ink: "He cannot tell which of us is real, but the forest knows." When the diary was brought back to town, the preacher refused to touch it, calling it the work of possession. Elias denied ever having seen it, though his face drained of color when shown the handwriting. The loggers who found it returned to the site days later, hoping to rebury the trunk, but it was gone, leaving only a hollow in the earth and a single footprint pressed into the mud, too small to belong to any of them. After the discovery of the diary, the Harrow cabin became quieter than ever. No smoke rose from its chimney, and no voices were heard through the trees. Elias was seen less and less, his once broad frame now gaunt, his eyes hollowed as if haunted by sleepless nights. But the strangest change came from the child. Once silent and eerily still, the infant began to murmur at night, soft, broken sounds that no one could make sense of. At first, Elias dismissed it as babbling, the natural noises of a growing child, but soon he realized the rhythm of the murmurs followed a pattern, notes that rose and fell like a song. The same song the sisters had sung before everything went wrong. The same lullaby that had once drifted through the forest, carried by two voices that now belonged to only one. Neighbors living on the edge of the woods said they began to hear it too. A soft tune rising from the cabin after midnight, faint but clear enough to recognize. Those who dared to listen longer claimed they could make out words, a melody sung not by one voice, but two, one light and melodic, the other lower, almost mournful. Elias tried to convince himself that grief had poisoned his mind, that exhaustion was making him hear things, but deep down, he knew it wasn't just in his head. The child's lips moved as if whispering to someone unseen, his tiny hand often reaching toward the empty cradle beside his bed. At times, Elias would find the cradle rocking slowly, the blankets inside indented as though something unseen had pressed against them. The child's health began to fail soon after. His skin grew pale, his eyes distant, and he often stared into corners, smiling faintly at nothing. He refused food and fell into strange fits of quiet laughter, followed by hours of unbroken silence. Elias called for the doctor, but when the men arrived, he found the child already cold, his body resting peacefully, a faint trace of a smile frozen on his lips. The lullaby lingered in the air for hours afterward, though no one was there to sing it. That night, travelers passing along the creek claimed they heard the same melody floating through the mist, sung by two voices blending in perfect harmony. In town, people said the baby had joined his mother, whichever one of them still remained. Others whispered that the forest had finally claimed what belonged to it, that the child had become part of the same haunting that had begun the moment the twins bound their lives, and their souls, to the same man. From that night on, the lullaby never stopped. It became part of the woods themselves, humming faintly through the pines like a sorrow that would never die. Many years passed before anyone dared to return to the Harrow woods. Time had swallowed the memory of the twins, the child, and Elias Ward beneath layers of rumor and silence. The cabin itself had long since rotted away, reclaimed by creeping vines and the slow, patient hunger of the forest. By the time the loggers came, drawn by the promise of fresh timber, only the faint outline of the cabin's foundation remained. The woods were dense and unnaturally quiet, the air cool and damp as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. As the men worked, their axes echoed through the hollow, but each strike seemed to fade too quickly, swallowed by the stillness that surrounded them. On the third day, while clearing a stretch near the old creek, one of the loggers' shovels hit something solid beneath the tangled roots of an oak. When they brushed the soil aside, the shape beneath the earth froze them in place. What they uncovered were bones, 2 sets, lying side by side, entwined in the thick roots that had grown around and through them over the years. The skeletons were identical in size and shape, their skulls tilted toward each other as if locked in an eternal whisper. One still had a thin ring of braided hair clinging to its scalp, while the other's bony fingers clutched a small object. When the dirt was carefully brushed away, the men saw what it was, a child's wooden rattle, its handle cracked and its paint long faded. The second skeleton's hand was closed around a tarnished silver band, still faintly gleaming beneath the grime. The men stepped back in silence, each feeling an unspoken dread that neither time nor reason could explain. A foreman ordered the bones reburied, fearing that disturbing them would bring bad luck. But before they could finish, one of the workers swore he heard something faint, a tune, soft and distant, coming from the trees. It was the sound of a lullaby, slow and sweet, carried on the wind that swept through the hollow. The men left their tools behind and fled, refusing to return the next day. Word spread through Willow Creek that the Harrow twins had finally been found, or at least what was left of them, though no one could say which one was which, or how they had died. Some believed Elias buried them there after the storm, consumed by guilt and madness. Others whispered that the forest itself had drawn them back together, binding them in its roots so they could never be apart again. And though decades have passed since that discovery, those who venture near the old creek at night claim they can still hear that lullaby drifting through the air, 2 voices in perfect harmony, singing to a child that never truly stopped crying.